Hi, everybody. We're getting ready for our second lecture for chapter 4, our week 4. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to go to the PowerPoint that I have for you. We're going to be talking in this particular one about the mechanisms of viral spread and pathogenesis. Pathogenesis, you want to think of, is the damage, the infection and damage that a virus can cause. The learning objectives for this particular mini lecture include describe ways viruses can spread within the host, name important organs that are targeted by viruses, list the 4 patterns of disease that viruses can cause, and name at least 3 factors that can affect viral survival in the environment. And remember, when we're talking about viral survival, because viruses are not living, we think of how do factors in the environment affect whether a virus remains active or inactive. With that, we'll move on to the next slide. Within the body, we can have replication and infection within the host. And we talked about that in the last lecture, about that portal of entry, attachment, and then invasion. We can have something called primary viremia, which means that we have virus in the bloodstream. And this can often lead to systemic infections. We can have both what are called a primary infection, meaning that it infects basically where that virus comes in for the portal of entry, attaches, and invades. But we can also get what we call systemic, which means that they move to different places in the body. So a localized viral infection would be concentrated, meaning that it doesn't spread from where that infection is taking place. Some examples of this might be warts that you would find on your skin, or some of the papillomaviruses that cause warts, for example, human papillomavirus that causes genital warts. With systemic viral infections, how do those viruses move throughout the body? In the body, viruses are generally spread in 2 different ways. One is that they can spread via the bloodstream. So if the virus gets into the blood, it can be spread to different areas where the blood is flowing in the body. In addition, viruses can spread through the peripheral nervous system. So our nervous system is divided into 2 parts. We have our central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is any of those spinal nerves or any of those, nerves that extend out into the body. And so I have just a couple of examples of this. So for example, enteroviruses, which tend to be ones that we ingest, will cause intestinal epithelium, will have a primary infection there where it can get into the blood. It can then travel to our lymphoid tissues, which is part of our immune system, and to our central nervous system, the spinal cord or the brain. We also have herpes simplex virus 1. This one is one that typically we get infected through the mouth, so the oropharynx in the throat, including the tonsils. And it can then go systemic through the lymphoid cells that are found in the tonsils and even get to the central nervous system. Herpes simplex virus 2, which generally we see as infection in the urogenital tract, also can then go in to lymphoid cells and be spread throughout the central nervous systems. So as we think about this, we want to think about some of the really important target organs that viruses can affect in the body. The first of which would be the skin, and we can get what we called rashes. So these are areas of the skin that become discolored. The technical term for those are exanthems. And we can see these in different ways. And I'll go to my whiteboard and kind of walk us through this vocabulary. So let's go over here. So some of the skin vocabulary or viral skin infection. Some of the vocabulary that I have up there then. The first one was macules. And macules are flat, discolored skin. So this would mean that you get no raising, no kind of bump from it. We can also have something called papules. These, on the other hand, are raised. So kind of a bump. discolored skin. And then we can get the ones that actually are filled with either some sort of a fluid. So we can get what are called vesicles. And you want to think of these as blister-like with clear fluid. And then the last one is the pustules. And these are blisters. Oops. Get in that R there. Blisters, excuse me, filled with pus. And generally speaking, this will either be white in color or yellow. And keep in mind that pus, and we'll get to this in the next week, pus is usually white blood cells that have come to try to clean up an infection. And often there'll be debris or dead cells there as well, but the white blood cells that have tried to fix the infection will be in that area. So hopefully that helps a little bit with that vocabulary. I'll go back to the PowerPoint. This is showing here that we might have something like herpes, and in this case, it's discolored and it's raised. It looks like it could either be clear or perhaps it does have pus in it. So we would say it has either a vesicle or pustule, depending on what that liquid looks like within. Other important target organs, the lungs and the liver. Typically, we see the lungs being affected by respiratory tract and viruses, right? We inhale the virus and it gets into our lungs and causes an infection there. With the liver, typically we see with something like hepatitis viruses, these would be ones that often we will ingest and they make their way into the liver. Hepatitis is just the word for inflammation of the liver. So these would be viruses that cause inflammation of the liver. We can also get infections with viruses that can affect our kidneys and heart, although these are less likely than some of the other organs. We can have cytomegalovirus and hantavirus that can affect the kidneys. And we have Coxsackie B, which can affect the heart. It can cause myocarditis, which is inflammation of the muscle of the heart. Other important target organs would include our nervous system, and we refer to these as neurotropic viruses, meaning that they can infect the nervous system. Keep in mind that I said the peripheral nervous system is those nerves that are outside the central nervous system. The central nervous system, though, as I said, is the brain and the spinal cord. And typically we think of these as more protected than our peripheral nervous system because there is something called the blood-brain barrier, which is semi-permeable. It basically tries to wall off the brain and the spinal cord from most things that can cause it harm, but often there are viruses that can actually get across that. Some examples that we have of viruses that can cross the blood-brain barrier include encephalitis viruses. Encephalitis, this is going to mean swelling of the brain, poliovirus, rabies, some of the herpes viruses, and Epstein-Barr virus are all viruses that we see that can make this jump across that blood-brain barrier and cause infection of the central nervous system. With these neurotropic viruses, how do they get into the nervous system? Keep in mind, remember that we think of the central nervous system as being somewhat protected. Typically, though, the nerves that are connecting the peripheral nervous system, so maybe nerves out in your hands or in your arms, legs, even in some of your torso, they are connected. They connect the body to the central nervous system. And so if the virus can move their way up the peripheral nervous system or nerves, they can actually get to the central nervous system. In addition, we have olfactory nerves that are in our nasal area that allow us to smell, but often viruses can use that nerve to work their way up to the brain. And then also we can get it when we have viruses in the blood. Remember, that's what the term viremia means. If we have viruses in the blood does do a blood supply to the brain, and sometimes viruses can tag along there as well. I also want to talk briefly about the idea that viral infections can actually spread through pregnancy. And this can happen at a number of different times during pregnancy, we can have what is called transplacental, which means that the virus actually goes from the mother to the embryo when it is in uterus, and it crosses through the placenta that's connecting the mother and embryo. It can also happen at perinatal, which means at the time of birth. There are many viruses that, if are found in the genital area, can be spread to an infant. And so that's something that we're keeping an eye on when a mother is delivering. And even postnatal transmission, often this can occur through breastfeeding. And so that's another way that we see it. We can have fairly severe infections depending on what the virus is. For example, we can have spontaneous abortion. So if it crosses that transplacenta, it can actually cause that embryo to spontaneously abort. It can cause stillbirths, and there can even be neonatal death. So at birth, the baby won't survive. There are some that are less lethal viruses, but can cause what we call congenital malformations, meaning that something from the virus that affects the infant in utero affects it in a way that when it's born, it has these malformations. One of those that's been in the news recently is Zika virus. Mothers who are pregnant and contract Zika virus can pass this through the placenta. And often what we see is something called microencephalopathy, and that just means that the baby is born with a much smaller head than what we think of as normal, and that is a real problem. Viral infections and pregnancy are not fully understood how this happens. So for example, transplacental transmission, there's very little known about how viruses can cross that placenta. We think of it as generally being fairly sterile, but some viruses are able to do that. In addition, we know that the immune status of the mother often changes during pregnancy. They're not necessarily completely immunocompromised, but the body is doing so much work to help develop this embryo that often the immune status is not as strong as it would be without being pregnant. I want to also talk about the idea of how diseases manifest themselves in the body. And we can think of kind of 4 patterns of viral infection, and I'll try to give you an example of each of these as we think about it. The first one is what probably most of us are most familiar with. It's called an acute infection. Basically, you get sick, your body fights it off, and then you recover, and you have no long-term lingering symptoms from it. Some of the ones that we would see with that are some of the adenoviruses and rhinoviruses. Rhinoviruses just cause the common cold. So basically, we have a period of time where we don't feel good, and then we recover from it. We can also have acute infections, basically where you get an infection and you have symptoms of it, and then where it goes to what we would call a persistent latent infection. So if you've ever had herpes virus, so getting cold sores around the mouth, or if you've had chickenpox as a child, we can see that these viruses can go latent within the immune system, or excuse me, within the nervous system, and then come back in flare-ups at a later time. So for example, during times of stress, or if you're exposed to sunlight, you might have cold sores that will come back out around the mouth. And that's because your body has never completely rid itself of the herpes virus. With chickenpox, we know that people can get chickenpox as a child. They recover from it, but that virus remains in their nervous system. And at some point later in life, usually after the age of 50, they may have a bout of shingles. And that's just the virus that's that has been latent, basically in hiding up until that point. The third pattern of viral infection is a chronic infection where we are continuously shedding the virus. So we never actually recover fully from it, and we're constantly shedding. So it doesn't go latent, we're actually shedding it all the time. Some examples of this are hepatitis B and C, and we'll talk about both of those a little bit later in the chapter, or excuse me, in the course. The last one that we can think about is something that is a slow infection. So you may be infected, but it may take years before it actually you have symptoms and you actually have the disease. And one of those would be HIV. HIV is a retrovirus, which means that it can take its RNA genome, retrotranscribe it into DNA, and insert it into the host cell chromosome. And it may go for years before it actually excises itself and starts to spread. So these are the 4 different patterns. Please note that I did put a diagram within this week so that you can see kind of what that looks like for the virus being produced in the body. The last part of this I want to talk about a little bit is the idea of how long does the virus persist in the environment. We know that viruses are not living, but they can be considered active or inactive. So we like to think about what allows them or what factors would affect their viability. So there's a number of different factors that we would see that could affect this. First of all is the composition of the virus. Naked viruses are actually much more able to be viable for longer periods of time in the environment than an enveloped. The enveloped virus, that phospholipid bilayer often can deteriorate, and then the virus is no longer viable. It also depends on whether the virus is present in human and animal waste. If it is present in those, it can last longer because it's actually in a place where it can continue to be viable. Temperature is one of those things we look at. Typically, we think of as cold temperatures as being preservation for viruses, but as temperatures go up, we think of them as being less viable. So increasing the temperature of food or increasing the temperature of some sort of object that you're using can often get rid of that virus. Humidity, often with humidity, we see that with dry air, the aerosolized viruses can stay in the air longer than if there's humidity that actually kind of the droplet of water brings it to the ground. And then lastly is pH. The pH, if it's not near neutral, we think of as being somewhat damaging to a virus. We also want to think about the idea of humans exposed to enteric viruses. Again, enteric viruses mean that they're something that you could ingest that could cause intestinal distress. We see these as often places where we would have viruses present would be the consumption of undercooked shellfish that's grown in contaminated water. So if the contaminated waters have virus and it's in the shellfish and then it's not cooked properly, it means that that virus would still be viable and could cause an infection. Food crops that are grown using wastewater for irrigation, and that could be either from human sewage as well as it could be from cattle, the wastewater that it has as irrigation, or even that we have human sewage as fertilizer. All of those we would imagine have viruses within the sewage, and that could get into the crops and actually make you ill. Lastly, if we have sewage polluted recreational and drinking water. So if you're swimming somewhere where there's sewage polluted recreational water and you ingest some of it, or if because of low standards with infrastructure, or we have some sort of a natural disaster, we would expect to see that viruses could survive in a sewer polluted recreational water or in drinking water. Viruses tend to be more stable in water than bacteria. So often when we think of some of these outbreaks, although bacteria can cause infection through water, viruses tend to be more stable. That leaves us with the checking in. I will let you pause it and then we'll come back. And after you've written the answers or you've said them out loud, you can come back and start the video up again where I will be answering these questions. The first question is, explain the difference between primary and systemic infections. So primary infections we think of as being in one location, although with primary viremia it means it moves into the bloodstream and then would allow it to travel to other places, which is what systemic infections are. Viruses that have traveled somewhere else in the body from where they entered. Name at least 2 important target organs of viruses. There should be the lungs, the heart, liver, kidney, skin, and the central nervous system are all ones that we can name. What must a virus cross to infect the central nervous system? The central nervous system is protected by the blood-brain barrier, and so a virus would need to cross that in order to infect the central nervous system. List the 4 patterns of viral diseases. Which would the common cold fall into? The 4 patterns are acute with a latent infection, chronic, and then slow infection. The common cold would fall into the acute infection. And then the last question is, name at least 3 environmental factors that influence viral viability. That would include humidity, temperature, pH, I'm trying to think, enveloped or non-enveloped, And did I have anything else? Oh, whether or not it's present in waste, human or animal waste, and in water. Hopefully that was helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.